So just for example, if I were to ask a question on the paper we went through and looked at on Tuesday, which was Ken Thompson's Reflections on Trusting Trust, and I asked you to, summarize the takeaway from that paper, you could write a few paragraphs if you wanted to, but really you can kind of distill it down in just a single sentence. And from different perspectives, there's maybe sort of a technical perspective and sort of a philosophical perspective. What is sort of the technical takeaway from that paper that we looked at on Tuesday? Open to suggestions. And it's okay if you get it wrong, right? You're not getting quizzed on this. What was he doing with software with regards to that paper?
Kind of like how do you make sure that your compiler, for example, is not inserting backdoors into the software?
Right. So he was showing a somewhat clever way that he, back in the early days, was inserting backdoors into software at the compiler level itself. The source code was unchanged, so auditing the source code would not show any changed functionality. And he also took it a step further and inserted a backdoor into the compiler in the first place. So auditing the compiler source itself would not reveal any discrepancies or any security issues with the compiler itself. Philosophically, the takeaway from that paper is, and he even has this sentence, you really can't ultimately trust any software that you didn't, independently build yourself from base principles on up. And there has been a trend towards sort of reproducible software, reproducible builds of software, effectively for this reason, the concern that specifically that there's a lot of trust involved in whether or not we are just downloading binary packages from various places, and how do we know that there haven't been things like backdoors inserted into the software. There has been some progress in trying to measure the various artifacts of the build process to ensure, well, at least it's consistent. At least my build is the same as this expected build, to gain some level of trust. But when we talk about the sort of categorization of malware and looking at things like backdoors, this is a pretty seminal accomplishment or a seminal paper that really sets the stage for the understanding of just the source code itself isn't really sufficient to understand whether or not there's vulnerabilities. The actual build process itself is part of it. That's where we left off on Tuesday, and this is just my own sort of personal historical timeline of malware, sort of a very famous early example of a worm that sort of self-replicated and was found in the wild, right? You had to have an internet to be able to have self-replicating worms. So relatively early days of the capital I internet, you had the so-called Morris worm, which took advantage of a buffer overflow and sort of self-replicated in the wild. The idea that the software itself was not just taking advantage of one vulnerability, it also had a second phase to it, right? Take advantage of this particular machine's vulnerability, install itself on that particular machine, and then look for other machines to infect. And that would allow for a much faster, branching out of infections, a much larger scope of machines that could be taken over via that piece of software. And also a little bit after this era is kind of the Microsoft failure era, in which there was this insertion of remotely accessible features in Microsoft operating systems that were seen as very valuable in terms of enabling more sort of business processes, but which, at least in those earlier days, the security of those remotely accessible processes weren't really considered important, or they were a secondary consideration versus the initial primary consideration. There's a pretty famous Bill Gates memo where he talks about how we've always gone toward, let's add new features and think about the security second. As an organization, they decided in the mid-90s, and it took quite a while to turn that ship around, to consider security of existing services first and new features second, because what there just was just a continuing sort of occurrence of these kind of internet shutting down worms that were existing in Microsoft software. It was an almost daily occurrence that there was something that was then infecting the whole world at any given period of time. The code writers didn't necessarily even need to be that clever in their era. They were just taking advantage of relatively low-hanging fruit of remotely accessible services with sort of well-understood vulnerability patterns in those services. So that's a very brief historical timeline of malware. But then we can talk a little bit about what it means to sort of classify malware. And again, in this particular subfield of computer security, there isn't a classification agency in the same way there is for our CVEs or even the weaknesses, the CWEs. We haven't talked much about common platform enumerations, but it's the same concept where we have a way of classifying particular software and hardware categories. There isn't really the same exact thing for malware, except for the fact that a particular piece of malware is typically tied to a CVE as well as to a CWE and a CPE. But otherwise, classifying what one piece of malware is attempting versus another piece is a bit more of an ad hoc thing. So this is one particular classification that's sort of the textbook one. And we can classify it via those three components. So the propagation. So for it to be this category of malware, how is it spreading? How is it replicating? That is part of how we use to describe a particular piece of malware. Separately, there's the trigger for that malware. Did it require some user activation to cause it to be installed? Or is it based on some other delivery mechanism here? And then finally, the actual payload itself. So some bad piece of software that is replicating based on some triggering condition. What does it do once it's actually onto the target? And again, in this class, we've pretty much decided that we're looking at remote shells and providing remote access and sort of breaking authentication. That's just one particular nature of a payload. There's many other things that the malware can do. So when we talk about kind of the grab bag of different malware names, think about it in terms of those three components here. How is it spreading? How is it actually sort of activating? How is it triggering? How is it being delivered? And then what does it do once it's actually placed onto a target? And again, there's other classification mechanisms out there, but within that three components here, you can pretty much put all these different terms, of which there's many different terms, into various buckets based on that. And again, we talked about the term virus on Tuesday, how it has sort of the biological inspiration for that term. It's a very rough analogy to the biological domain, where we have things that are spreading outside of a host. That's our virus. A virus, as a particular piece of malware, is just designed to replicate to other programs or documents on the infected machine. That is in comparison to a worm, which is thought of as a more standalone piece of software. The idea is that it is replicating itself. That's a pretty subtle distinction between the two things here. Usually when we think of someone having had a virus on their computer, that is based on some particular action that they then did to install it, where a worm's intention is to propagate itself. So there is perhaps some initial infection approach or scheme that happened, and then from there, its goal is to kind of self-replicate to other machines here. You can look at your white blood cells in action and see what they do. That's not a virus they're attacking, but that's a piece of bacteria. But still, it's kind of cool. That's our human body's antivirus software at work. It's actually a very active thing. It's not a passive thing. Let's talk about one famous worm example. We could talk about the Morris worm as well, but this is the blaster worm. And with many of these early worms, it really just wasn't one thing. And it's not even clear if blaster was sort of the first example of this. There'd be some basically code patterns that were published or shared. And then there'd be many different types of worms with different names that are doing roughly the same thing based on the same classification class of weaknesses here. So in this case, we talk about the blaster worm. We have the source code for the blaster worm. We can look at it. There's a good dozen other worms in this same exact rough period of time that are doing roughly the same exact thing here. The developer of this one got caught and sentenced, and we know a lot more about this particular worm than perhaps some of the others, the genesis of this worm. So in this case, again, we're back to buffer overflows. So there was an RPC service. The idea is it was very useful to be able to remotely tell another computer to run some particular function. That's a good thing to have. It allows you to do sort of network communication and other things. But if that's not locked down, carefully, that becomes a pretty live target. And things like an exploited buffer overflow then says you have this service. Now we're telling this remote computer to do all sorts of different things, including go and download this code. And that itself can lead to a worm, propagating. It was believed, and again, this case is a little bit more documented than others because there was a trial and a conviction, and we know a little bit more about how these things happen than in some other cases. We talked about, and the quiz question asked about Patch Tuesday leading to Exploit Wednesday. This is an example of that this was already a patched service, but your patches aren't instantaneously rolled out. They are pushed, and then there's this propagation period for the patch itself. If you see a patch for a particular service that is looking to fix a particular part of the code for it, that's a target, and that's where a hacker could look next to determine where that vulnerability would be here. What's kind of interesting about this is a couple of things. First off, and we can look at the source code. We've looked at a few different malware source codes already. They're a little interesting for different reasons. This was definitely the work of an amateur, and there's nothing wrong about that. And maybe it was easier back in 2003 than in 2024 to write malware. There's just lots of like logic errors in the code, and it sort of works in some cases kind of inadvertently, but it was very effective. That's one reason it's interesting, and we can look at the code for it. But this, and it wasn't just this one, but there was a dozen that all came out one after the other that sort of forced Microsoft and others to get more serious about software security. And as we saw, we look at various hot fixes and service patches, packs that are coming from Microsoft. There are still so many CVEs that are discovered on a day-to-day basis. Typically, the burden for an attacker is a lot higher now than it certainly was back in that era. We can look at what was exploited here. We can look at the source for the blaster worm, and it depends on what courses you've taken. I think if you've taken a networking course and if you've taken an operating systems course, if you were around in 2003, you could have written the blaster worm yourself. So it's not that advanced in terms of what it is doing here. So we can take a quick look at let's see if I can find it, the source code for it. Minnesota teenager was convicted of writing a version of this. Let's see, make this a little bit more visible on the screen here. He was a teenager. So some things the teenager did is he just left some little messages there for people who were reverse engineering the worm later to kind of discover later on. He's looking for the remote procedure call port 135. He's eventually checking if there's sort of an FTP software running on it, which is included and still included in all versions of Windows. And then he is just checking to see if that port is open on a machine, opening up a socket connection to a particular IP address, randomizing what location to look at, but there's a couple bugs in how it does it here, and then eventually just sort of copy pasting another attack's shellcode over the socket. This is just CPRE 489 style socket code that we're running here. I have to scroll down a little bit more to find the actual shellcode that's included, the exploit, and just copy and pasted from some other existing exploit that was found there. So this is something that it would be a class assignment. It would probably take a couple weeks, but you could probably write yourself. You need to know a little bit more about writing networking code if you haven't done that before. It's just something we learn. Probably today people would write it in Python, but it could very easily be done in C, C++, or other languages as well. And the takeaway is not that the code is mature or not that mature, is that it was a relatively easy thing for not just one person to implement, but for anyone who had that goal in mind to implement. There was just enough insecure things in that era that it effectively ultimately required sort of a rewrite of all those core Windows services, which took place over a period of years. And we're still seeing those vulnerabilities now, but when you see a CVE in a core Windows service now, it could be exploitable, but it usually requires a much more mature kind of exploit development path than just spam this socket, overflow this buffer, execute this shellcode in the system. So when we talk about how Trojans or how malware can propagate, the term we've used before, just to fully clarify it for us, is the concept of a Trojan, or the term you'll hear is just a Trojan horse. This is from the ancient Greeks, the idea that to win the war against Troy, the warriors hid themselves in a wooden horse that they presented as a gift. So the idea is you're hiding something that looks legitimate, and there's actually malware inside of it. So the software at first glance appears to be something legitimate that's being installed, but it's actually inside that software is actually doing perhaps also the legitimate purpose, but then also the malicious purpose as well. So oftentimes when we talk about these, it's directly related to that prior topic on social engineering. Doesn't necessarily require social engineering, but sort of fundamentally it is also about tricking a user, convincing someone to install something that they have reason to believe is got a legitimate use, but in fact it may have that use in addition to the malicious use here. So in terms of how things actually propagate, with our Trojan, it has to do with tricking a user, convincing someone to install something that they shouldn't be installing here. So we talked about how something being a virus or a worm, right? A virus is something that you install yourself. A worm is something that gets propagated automatically. So very quick quiz-like question here. A user clicks a link on a site to download Acrobat Reader, then installs the downloaded program. Turns out that it's a malware program that propagates itself over the network. What would you classify or call this malware?
Trojan virus.
Trojan's correct. So you're halfway there. Definitely Trojan. So you got it. Okay, you got it. Right. So Trojan, in that it's you were tricked, whether you were tricked or whether you tricked yourself, right? Someone's looking for, how do I install this video game without paying for it, and you find some installer or Adobe Acrobat, sure. How do I find this software without actually having to pay for it? So whether you're tricked or whether you're just not acting in a very trustworthy manner, that would be a Trojan. Hey, install, get this piece of software that you actually want. Then what does it do after it's been installed? How it's propagating further? If it's then looking to propagate itself over the network, then it wouldn't just be a traditional Trojan, it would be a Trojan worm here. Right, we think about different network architectures, network organizations here. You may have your own internal network, which is really protected against worms attempting to self-propagate over port 135 or whatever that prior example was showing here. But if you can get one user inside that network to go and install your Trojan, then maybe you can propagate internal to the network after that fact. So there's not so many examples of exactly that happening, but it's a valid categorization here, which you trick the user, that's the initial install point, and then you propagate afterwards in an automated way, and there are scenarios in which that would be a valid way to think about it. So that's all this topic that we're going to do today and finishing up after we get back from break is all about. Just the different ways of propagating, triggering, and the different types of payload here, and what type of terminology we would use to refer to those things. This doesn't really refer to the payload side of things at all. You could argue that the worm functionality itself is a type of payload, and if we were to look at the the blaster worm, that's almost the case. What I didn't show in the code here is it wasn't just propagating for the sake of propagating like the Morris worm was doing. It was also then attempting to do denial of service and other attacks via that propagated network. So there's usually some other piece of um, functionality that we would want to classify it as. In fact, that's somewhere in the source code for it as well, in that it would actually check whether or not it had already been installed on that particular machine, and it wouldn't attempt to kind of repropagate itself on that same machine. So it would check, creating a mutex, creating sort of a shared variable on the system, saying, and call it, in this case, Billy. I think he's referring to Bill Gates. Create something called Billy. If that already existed on the machine, then stop. Meaning this machine has already been infected with this version of the virus. If we go back to that Morris worm, which wasn't really intending to do anything malicious ultimately, it didn't have that type of check in it. So it became a malicious worm because it just kept spreading and spreading and spreading, including on the same machines over and over and over again. And with relatively limited hardware back in the day, eventually those machines would slow down or just shut down entirely because they were infected over and over and over again. That was more of a proof of concept and an experiment than something that was intended as malicious. This one, whether it was someone just trying to have fun, they at least thought about that consideration, that there was a separate payload, a separate goal of the software than just being a worm propagating for the sake of propagating. Other ways malware can propagate. It's also still related to this concept of sort of tricking a user. it's related to the idea of a Trojan horse, this concept of a drive-by download, which it doesn't exactly say what vulnerability is being taken advantage of here, but the idea is that you would navigate to a website and the website itself would attempt to download and potentially install a piece of software for you. If you want to distinguish those two situations, the traditional Trojan horse and the drive-by download, the Trojan horse is usually something you are attempting as the user to do. You are actively seeking out an executable to install on your system because you have some goal in mind. I want to download this game or this application and I'm just going to this link to do so. And it happens to have that malicious functionality. A drive-by download could also have a social engineering aspect to it, but it tends to also be a vulnerability in the web browser itself. That by navigating to a particular website, the web browser is then prompting you to download and install a piece of software. That is a little bit less of an issue now than it used to be. And maybe if you use web browsers that either have sort of script blocking add-ons or kind of just built into the browser itself, you may not be seeing that much in this day and age. That used to be a very big problem, that there wasn't kind of native built-in, ad block, micro block type software added on to into the web browser for you. And just by navigating to a particular website, and back then there was less protection against kind of web pages forwarding you to other web pages as well, you would get drive-by downloads. You need to install this plugin to continue on the website, and if you weren't careful, that would be your malware installed there. Related to the concept of drive-by download is that of a watering hole attack. The idea being that you're targeting the drive-by download to a particular user or a class of users. So watering hole meaning a place where people or animals are likely to visit and expected to visit. If you know there's a user or a class of user that tends to go to a particular site or class of websites, you could then install malware on their machines by targeting those websites specifically. Looking for examples of actual watering hole attacks, it tends to be sort of state actors doing such things because it oftentimes requires some cooperation amongst legitimate organizations to be able to infect computers via this mechanism. You hear about it with Tor and the dark web quite a bit, where the FBI or other state agencies looking to infect software used for that, to be able to track users or find out personal information about users doing potentially illegal things here. That's the watering hole attack. There's also this concept of malvertising. I mean, one small nice thing about kind of the Google relative monopoly on online advertising is you see less of this than you used to. But malvertising is then just a combination or portmanteau of malware with advertising, in which the advertising channel itself was being used to inject malware. That may be hard to see in today's day and age, where there's all sorts of now sort of quasi standards associated with online advertisements. But it used to kind of be a wild west, right? You would have a website, you would contract with an advertising company. It could be DoubleClick, it could be a lot of other companies in that era as well. They would then contract with other third-party companies to actually then deliver. And there's a little bit of a hands-off nature to it, in which you have a relationship with the advertising company. They would have something of a relationship with these additional third parties. And the end result is, for a reasonable price, one could insert malware into particular advertising channels here. And that's what I was kind of getting at with that first sub bullet point there, that at least in that prior to monopolistic eras, there wasn't as much complete control about the nature of advertisements that were hosted on a site. And so you would have advertisements that would make use of a drive-by download, or require a click to exploit and potentially sort of trick the user into clicking on something on an advertisement, leading to a further exploit there. That is directly related to this idea of clickjacking. The more academic term is UI, user interface redress attack. It's when you're being tricked into clicking a malicious link, oftentimes just via using some styling or HTML attributes that sort of hide the malicious link nearby or directly transparently above the legitimate link. What was a very common thing in earlier days was using on a website, you'd have a button to click like or to click share or to click some other social media interaction with a website. And if an advertisement or other website was sort of hiding some malicious activity, that'd be one place where they could hide it. I provided a link. I have it open here. You can get a basic feel without being an HTML expert of what a malicious, see if I can zoom on this a bit more, what a malicious like button would look like back in the day. The idea being that you'd have some sort of potentially viral post or something that you would want people to maybe click more to find out more about it. There would also be an option then to click like on it as well. But as part of that, there was the legitimate like button, but on top of it was just a transparent container that you would actually be clicking instead of the like button itself. This is a sort of well-recognized vulnerability in acting with the web. And so you actually see less of this basic functionality and more of that siloed into custom user applications in the first place, web applications in the first place. And you have certain features in web browsers that make this type of attack a little bit less likely than it was, even 4 or 5 years ago than it is now. We often then, and in terms of what we do in practice in a lab environment, we think of the malware as acting immediately after the system is exploited. You clicked, you installed something, all of a sudden something bad has happened on your computer. We run that in the lab just for practical purposes. We want to have a vulnerable software, we want to exploit it, we want that exploit to take place immediately. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? Just like any other piece of software, the functionality that you want to happen can happen based on programmer developer specified triggers. And so we talk about how malware is actually being activated as one of the ways of categorizing it. That particular trigger is something that turns it into different things. So the other term you'll hear is a logic bomb, which just means there's some logical condition that then triggers when the malicious activity is actually executing. There's a little bit of semantics there, right? The malware itself is the malicious software as a whole. So when it is installed, you could argue that the malicious activity has already happened, right? You have something installed on your system that you did not want, presumably, to have installed on your system. That's sort of malicious in and of itself. But beyond that, the actual activity, the actual other bad thing it wants to do, think of it running a denial of service attack or leaking information or whatever bad thing that you want, that the malware developer wants to do, that itself could be a separate trigger. So there's the drive-by download or Trojan or malicious advertising that causes that initial infection, that initial installation of the software, but maybe it doesn't appear to have done anything bad at first. And that there's some value in that, right? You may want to wait, that's sort of the rhetorical question there, for a period of time before that malicious activity is actually going to happen after that initial installation process. Presumably, the longer you wait or the more obscure condition you wait for that malicious activity to happen, that presumably makes it harder to track down the actual source, the genesis of the malware itself. If you installed this fake Adobe Acrobat today, but only 6 months from now, and that's not that likely, but let's just say 6 months from now, something very bad happens on your system, it could be very hard to track down that was the cause, right? You presumably would have completely forgotten about this Trojan Adobe Acrobat software that maybe also includes the correct functioning Adobe Acrobat software as well, that it in fact was waiting and lying in wait for 6 months to attack your system later. That's the value of having kind of non-immediate, non-obvious triggers. And then the terms we use is just a logic bomb when it's some condition that's met, whether a particular user is logged in, whether a particular file is present, or whether some other software then becomes installed, versus a time bomb, which is just when there's a particular time-based trigger for that software to kick off. And again, it could be to prevent detection, easy detection. Other times for the logic bomb, it's only going to be a useful piece of malware if a particular condition is actually going to be met. And then oftentimes malware has particular goals. It could be a political goal that on Guy Fawkes Day in November, it wants to take down some particular website. I was trying to think of a reasonably innocuous, day of the year that would cause for some time bomb to go off. I don't know, or Valentine's Day, because the malware attacker really hates the commercialization of Valentine's Day. That's when the malware would potentially go off. Or just, again, waiting just for the sake of waiting to make that correlation between the activity and the actual infection make it more difficult to track down. So intent does matter. Whether something is malware or not is sometimes not a technical determination. Um, Sometimes it's a legal determination. Whether the software you installed required that you agree to some legal terms saying that this functionality is going to change after 6 weeks, right? If you install a piece of software and it says it will work for 6 weeks, and then after 6 weeks you have to then pay for it, that is a time bomb in terms of like the logic of the code changing after 6 weeks. That's probably not malware unless you didn't realize that was going to be the case, and it wasn't that obvious that was going to be the case. So whether it's technical or not, um, sometimes it's sort of a matter of sort of legal opinion, something that has to be resolved in a court, whether it was malicious or not, whether there's any actual fault or not. There's all sorts of reasons malware writers, use logic or time bombs here. This example, I won't bring up the article, but the link's available for you to take a look at. There were two competing, kind of hard to believe, two competing Polish train manufacturers or different companies that were rated to service particular train cars. You think of that as being sort of a mechanical service, but of course there's all sorts of software running on these things as well. So it's both mechanical as well as electrical, electronic servicing, software servicing as well. And it turned out, and this is one of the things that was discovered in sort of legal proceedings, that one train manufacturer was programming their locomotives to stop working when sent to particular geo-fenced locations. So that would be a logic bomb, right? Based on a condition being met, not a time-based condition, turn off some particular piece of functionality. Is it malware or not? Again, it meets the conditions of being a logic bomb, right? Functionality that changes when a condition is met. It probably meets the definition of, malicious, right? It stopped working. Whether it's legally actionable malware, well, that's a legal issue, right? Depends on contracts and things like that. In this case, I don't think there was any such contracts. But why would they have done that in the first place? So why would Company A have Newag was the name of it, set a piece of logic bomb in their own control software to shut down the locomotive when sent to this particular location? Why do you think they would do it? And the assumption is that no, they're not evil. That's not the assumption here.
Then they'd have an opportunity to fix it and
Yeah, their goal would be to limit who has the capability to do those kind of maintenance and repairs. This comes up a little bit. Those of you who have more of an agricultural background, family or otherwise, with certain companies based in Iowa, with their tractors and other things, and who they want to allow to do that type of what is effectively software maintenance on those complicated machines. Whether they want the quote unquote owner of the machines to be able to do it, or whether they want it to be limited to just certified, authorized, repair and maintenance, um, companies that have been contracted to do that. Again, is that malware or not, right? If I have a piece of software that you can only update the software if you have the particular update key for it, I think it's partially a legal discussion, not necessarily a technical discussion whether that's malware or not. Intent matters, agreed upon terms matters in advance. The issue why this became a story is because those terms weren't agreed upon in advance. There was no understanding at time of purchase that they could only be maintained at this particular facility, and so that leads you in legal hot water. This case, I think, is devious and quite clever. Those are both legal documents I linked to there. You can again look at them, offline in your own time. So this is Siemens, which is a company that does all sorts of different things, but certainly employs lots of software developers. This is a press release of an actual conviction, or the guy pled out to. He was developing spreadsheets, which don't look down upon spreadsheets. Spreadsheets run a whole chunk of the world, and there's lots of complicated software in spreadsheets. As he worked for the company, he developed a whole bunch of these spreadsheets, which, for want of a better description in the legal documents, they managed some business process for the company, and I think that's sufficient discussion. And it turns out the files worked for years, but they stopped working around 2014, after which he was then hired to go back to the company and consult to fix those particular spreadsheets. Why would he do that? Why would he program the spreadsheets to stop working after a period of time? What was his motive?
You get hired back.
To get paid, yeah, I guess, right? To make money to kind of fix what he himself broke. Um, Again, there's sort of a technical discussion to be had there. What if he was just a bad software developer, right? And then had to get hired back to fix the things that he broke? What if he wrote really bad and hard to maintain and hard to read code? I guess, again, intention is sort of a legal concern, not a technical concern. The intention behind the developer, is it a bad developer, or is it someone who is actually quite capable and is intentionally adding a time bomb? It refers to it as a logic bomb, but this would really be a time bomb here, which was effectively in the code. If X number of days, months, weeks, seconds, whatever it is, has passed, stop working was effectively in the code. Stop working and contact your consultant to see how to get the code to work again. I say it's devious. It's actually quite ingenious too, right? And until he got caught, this seems like a pretty good plan for sort of career, tenure and safety, and continue to be hired on to kind of fix things that he himself broke. That probably then classifies itself as being malware as well, right? It's a time bomb. Code worked until it didn't work intentionally. Wasn't necessarily doing anything else malicious, but if it stopped functioning, that is also a type of malicious behavior here. So why would malware writers use logic or time bombs? Well, there's a couple of aspects to that answer. The first is to evade immediate detection. If his code stopped working every hour, that would not serve its intentional purpose, right? Or if it never worked, of course, it wouldn't be serving its intention either, right? If it never worked in the first place. But by having a whatever it was, it says here somewhere that it would just trigger after a certain date and kind of cause it to crash. Um, that's a time bomb, and he does that for that purpose. The separate kind of related question is, why do people write malware in the first place? Well, some people just want to break things, and so you have to respect people who have that as their intention. Others have a direct kind of financial goal in mind by writing malware. So we do typically have to understand those incentives. Once you're a victim of this, maybe the incentives matter less, but we have to understand those incentives to understand why these things continue to keep happening. In this case, whether you call that greed or just being very slightly too clever, I don't know, but this is a press release of a sentencing, right? This is someone who actually didn't quite get away with it. If you look a little bit further, you always kind of wonder, did he wind up kind of winning in the end? I think once you're convicted, you could say you probably didn't win, but he made quite a bit of money along the way. We've talked a couple times about Stuxnet. We've kind of talked about it piecemeal over time. It is just a pretty complicated piece of software, and probably the most famous piece of malware of all time, I would say at this point. Again, intent matters. Stuxnet's goal was to destroy centrifuges. Is that malicious? Certainly from the owners and users of that centrifuge, the answer is certainly yes. But this was state actors acting upon other state actors, and so whether it's legal or not really depends on who's in charge and who is suing whom, or who is trying to conduct war against whom. So, but what was interesting in terms of this categorization of malware for Stuxnet, it was very precise in terms of the trigger of its functionality. Beyond just the actual infection itself, which apparently used 0 days, 4 previously unknown Windows vulnerabilities to take over a computer, it was then very circumspect in terms of its activity. You have some of these other worms whose goal is really just to make as much noise as possible. Let's just spread as quickly as possible. Let's just cause some havoc and see what happens. You have these other malwares that are attempting to be a bit more subtle, but eventually via some logical or time-based condition will start their malicious activity. Here, this would also qualify, as a logic bomb, in that it was looking for, on the system and infected, whether a particular library, also Siemens, but it's not at all related to the previous example here, that was used in SCADA systems control. So industrial control software, not so different from some of the IoT things we were talking about prior in the prior topic. Looking for a key library that's used in SCADA systems control. If it didn't find it, just went to sleep. I don't know if it removed itself entirely, but it just stayed inert. It then also had to finally look, once a particular piece of hardware and category of hardware was installed, PLC systems to control some other piece of hardware, only would it actually then trigger at that point, and it would actually look to see not just that that hardware was being used, but whether it was hardware that was being connected and being spun up in a range required by gas centrifuges. So this was part of Iranian nuclear program, and they were trying to enrich uranium. And then there was these industrial plants where this was happening. And as everything in the world still connected to Windows computers, and only when all those conditions were met was the logic bomb actually triggered. So definitely a little bit more advanced than just waiting 6 months or waiting for a particular file to be present. But ultimately, it's not that different, right? So you're checking for libraries, those are just files. You're checking for particular devices to be installed. In Windows, that's just a separate enumeration of those particular devices and seeing what drivers are being loaded as well. And then only if a particular range of operation was happening, that required some sort of low-level, control embedded knowledge of what was happening with those attached systems here. And then its job was just to break those systems. And it was doing so via, if it was meant to rotate or cycle at a particular rate, it would constantly just drive it high, then drive it low over and over and over again, and just eventually burn out the motor. So this was a very targeted piece of software, probably classifies as malware because it is trying to break something, right? Whether it was legal, whether it was just, that's all legal and philosophical discussions. From the technical perspective, that's certainly a piece of malware. It is uh, a, um, a virus that then had a logic bomb associated with it that was very particular logic bomb and particular conditions that was then actually breaking a piece of hardware, attempting to, that was connected to those computers. Let's leave things here for today. You guys have a whole week off. Enjoy, see family, eat turkey, whatever you do over next week, or just work on the lab while we're away from class. I'll see you over in a week from Tuesday.